If you've been worried about the United States going into a recession and you want to see how you can protect your money or grow your money through this shifting economy, this video is for you. The United States economy is facing three blows at the exact same time. Number one is the United States has just entered into war with Iran and we don't know how many dollars this is going to cost. Number two, AI is getting smarter and in the next 5 years it is going to transform the job market in a way that we've never seen before. Take a listen.
The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, on Wednesday released a study that found that artificial intelligence can already replace 11.7% of the U.S. labor market, or as much as 1.2 trillion in wages across finance, healthcare, and professional services.
At number three, we're starting to see cracks on Wall Street, with big firms like BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, and Blackstone all blocking investors from pulling their money out of these private credit funds because these funds were losing so much money. And in the words of the CEO of JP Morgan Chase Bank, when you start to see these cracks on Wall Street, he calls them cockroaches. When you see one, there's probably more hiding. Now, a recession has nothing to do with the stock market. A recession has to do with all spending that happens in the economy, and the technical definition of a recession is when you see 2 quarters, meaning 6 months of the economy shrinking. And over the last number of years, we've been seeing the economy grow here in the United States. In 2020, the economy was $21.4 trillion large. This is a number measured called GDP. 2021 was 23.7 trillion, 2022 was 25.7 trillion, 2023 27.4 trillion, 2024 29.2 trillion, and 2025 is $31.1 trillion. And now the question is, what's going to happen in 2026 now that we have this war happening in the Middle East, now that we have these changes happening with AI, and now that we're seeing these cracks on Wall Street? Are we going to see the economy shrink or continue to grow? And that's what I want to talk about in this video. So let's break this all down. I want to start by talking about what's going on Wall Street. Then I want to talk about the war in the Middle East and its impacts on the economy. And then number three, I want to talk about AI and its impact on our economy and the job market. So let's break this down, because what's going on Wall Street has been largely overlooked, but it has huge implications. Let's say a business and you need to go out and borrow, let's call it $200 million. And you go to somewhere like Chase Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and you want to borrow this money like any other business would, but the bank says no. They say no either because you're not creditworthy, because the amount of money is not right, or maybe because the business that you're doing is not something that they want to lend you money on, so you cannot go and borrow this money from a traditional bank. What do? You still need this $200 million. Instead, what you do, and what's been happening, is going through something called private credit. That means essentially you're going to go to one of these hedge funds. So this might be a firm like Blackstone. It might be BlackRock. It might be Blue Owl. It might be Morgan Stanley, who've built these investment funds that are going to lend you money. In exchange, you're going to pay them very high interest rates. Now, the reason why you're going to pay these high interest rates is because these hedge funds know that you cannot go and borrow this money from a traditional bank. So you're kind of desperate, and because you're more desperate, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate. Well, that serves good for the business because now you get the money, the hedge fund makes money, but this hedge fund also needs money to keep paying these loans because it's not a traditional bank. So where's the hedge fund actually getting the money to lend money to these businesses? Well, it's getting money from people like you and me, regular investors. It's getting money from banks like Bank of America, Chase Bank, and other banks now who want to invest their money. They're lending money to these hedge funds. You are lending money to these hedge funds because it's an investment. And now because this hedge fund is charging these businesses 12, 15, 18% a year, they might pay you 10% a year in interest on your money. So it's a good investment for you, because if you put your money in the bank, you're going to get, 0%, 1%, 2%, 3% if you're lucky in interest. This is going to give you 10% in interest on your money. So investors said, that sounds pretty good. I trust these big institutions to make good investments on my behalf. So let me go and invest my money into this hedge fund. So lots of investors invested billions of dollars. Banks invested billions of dollars. In fact, some say it's trillions of dollars into these hedge funds that were then lending money out to these businesses. Well, over the last number of months, we started to get more and more reports that these hedge funds were actually making loans to businesses that were cash flow negative. In fact, what they said is that 40% of these businesses that were borrowing money had negative cash flow when they were borrowing money, meaning they were losing money every single day when they started to borrow money from these hedge funds. Well, okay, no big deal. People kind of brushed that off. But then in the end of 2025, we started to see some bankruptcies happen with these businesses. And there were some pretty big bankruptcies, which meant that these businesses were borrowing huge sums of money from these hedge funds. And now because interest rates are high, they're not making the money, so they were not able to pay this money back to the hedge fund. Not just the interest, but the loan as well. Now you can start to see the problem. You start to see some bankruptcies here because the economy is slowing and interest rates are high. They're not paying back the interest or the loan back to these hedge funds, and now these hedge funds now are bleeding money. Well, what happens then? You and these banks, these investors are seeing, I may be a little bit concerned about this hedge fund's ability to continue paying this 10% a year interest because I'm getting concerned about these businesses. I'm getting concerned about the economy. So what started happening in 2026 is these investors started to pull their money out of their hedge funds, saying, you know what, I'm just going to take my money and put it somewhere else, put it somewhere safer, because yes, this is a great rate of return, but I'm getting concerned because we're starting to see a lot of bankruptcies happen here. So investors started to pull their money out. And then what happened is a couple of weeks ago, Blackstone said, we can't let you pull your money out anymore, because if you do, we are going to collapse. So Blackstone then paused withdrawals. That made investors worried. You're saying we can't access our money anymore? Imagine going to the bank tomorrow and the bank says you can't have your money back because we're scared that if you pull your money out, that we're going to collapse. Now that doesn't happen with banks because banks are FDIC insured, they're regulated in many other ways, so that doesn't happen. But this is not a bank. It's not regulated the way the banks are. So the hedge fund had to essentially stop that run on the bank, in this case the run on the hedge fund, by stopping you from accessing your money. What happened next? More investors got concerned and said, if Blackstone is having this problem, maybe other companies are facing the same issue. So then people went to go pull their money out of Blue Owl. Blue Owl then froze withdrawals as well. They said, you cannot have your money back either. And then investors said, we need to get our other money back. They then went to BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, and they started pulling their money out of BlackRock. And then BlackRock said the same thing. You can't have your money back because if you do, this fund is going to collapse. And that continued to happen. And then Morgan Stanley said the exact same thing. People started to pull their money out of Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley said, you cannot access your money. Why is this such a problem? Because this is exactly what we saw happen leading up to the 2008 crash. In 2007, Bear Stearns saw a couple of their hedge funds really start to struggle. And so those hedge funds then paused withdrawals. They did not let investors pull their money out of these hedge funds from Bear Stearns. Everybody said, it's just isolated to those hedge funds, to that industry. And then in 2008, the entire financial system started to melt down. Today, in 2026, everyone's saying the same thing. This is just the private credit industry. It's just these businesses. It's just some of these hedge funds. It's isolated. Now, is it going to spread? We don't know. This is why Jamie Dimon says when you start to see one cockroach, there's probably others hiding in the shadows as well. And the real concern that people have is this part right here, the banks. That there are a lot of banks that are heavily exposed to these hedge funds that are on the verge of collapse. And these banks could then face serious struggle because if they don't get their money back, these banks could lead to some failures as well. Now that again depends on if these hedge funds fail or not. We will see what happens in the coming days, weeks, months. But that's something you want to pay attention to because that could create a more domino effect on Wall Street. And that's the real concern that you want to pay attention to. So this is the first issue that you want to pay attention to because investors are clearly starting to see pain because businesses are struggling due to these higher interest rates. And we're starting to see that pain through these hedge funds because now many hedge funds across Wall Street were on the verge of collapsing and had to pause withdrawals so that they didn't collapse. Which brings me to the second thing that's happening in our economy right now, which is the war in the Middle East. After the United States attacked Iran, we saw oil prices spike in the United States. Why? It's not just because Iran is a big producer of oil, it's because Iran controls something called the Strait of Hormuz. Now what that is, it's a passageway where cargo ships transport oil from one part of the world to the other. And about 20% of the global supply of oil goes through this strait. And so once the United States attacked Iran, they blocked that strait and said no more oil can pass through. That makes it extremely difficult for oil to go from one part of the world to the other, which essentially decreases the supply of oil. And now when you have less oil, the price of oil goes up because people still need oil for gas. They still need oil for producing fertilizer. They still need oil for a lot of other parts of our economy. Well, that's why oil prices went up. And this high oil prices impact every part of the economy because oil is used in everything. So the concern is high oil prices mean inflation is going to get worse. Let me read you what Moody's had to say. If oil prices stay near current levels at $100 per barrel, gasoline will be closing at on $4 a gallon by this time next week. Inflation will quickly accelerate, cutting into consumers' purchasing power and hitting consumer spending, GDP, and jobs. Now, this is where things start to get really tricky. Now, talking about war is never easy because there is so much human loss of life, and I don't want to disregard that at all. But I want to really help you understand what's going on the financial side, because there's a lot of people already talking about the other side of war. But I want to talk about the financial side because it is important for you to understand as well. On one side, higher oil prices mean higher inflation for the prices of pretty much everything. But then on the other side, when we look at the economy, war is big business. What do I mean by that? Well, every time there's a bomb dropped, there's a plane going out, anytime there's a ship being attacked, all of those things cost money. And that means when there is war, the United States government is going to be spending more dollars on these defense companies. More companies producing artillery, producing military equipment, producing tanks, producing jets, all of that stuff. Now, why does that matter? Because this number right here, called GDP, is a measure of all spending that happens in the United States economy. Well, the largest spender in our economy is not you or me. It's not Amazon or Tesla or Nvidia. It is the United States government. Now, why does that matter? Because here in 2020, when the pandemic hit, the United States government started to spend a lot of money it didn't have. It started to spend money on stimulus checks and unemployment checks and PPP loans and business grants. It was just creating this money and spending it. Well, that spending of money boosted the economy. I mean, you can see between 2020 to 2021, our economy grew, which at first glance is going to seem a little bit weird because remember, in 2020, the economy was shut down. People were not working. And if people are not working, how is the economy growing? Well, because the government was sending out this money, and so spending was happening. Here's the part that you have to remember. Just because the government spends money doesn't mean that there's not going to be consequences. And so now here we are in a situation where right now we have a lot of national debt. Our national debt here in the United States is so expensive that in 2025, the United States government spent more money on interest payments on our debt than we did on our entire military. Which means, yes, our debt is expensive because we already have so much debt. And so we're already spending more money than we have. And now when you have this war going on, you bet that means that government expenses are going to skyrocket. Every single day the war goes on, dollars get spent. And that's dollars that the government doesn't have. But the United States government has one source of revenue, tax dollars from taxpayers. And the government isn't raising your taxes, at least not today, which means they're going to have to get the money from somewhere else, which means debt. And when the government is borrowing money, some of the money has to be printed, which means more money creation, more dollars lose value, because as you print more money, what we learned from the pandemic and other instances, but in the recent history, when you print money, it causes the value of the dollar to go down, causing the prices of things to go up. That's why we've seen so much price growth between 2020 to today. And incomes haven't kept up. Why? Because we just printed money, but we didn't print wealth. You cannot